He starred in over 100 movies. He won an Oscar, but it was in his final moments that Charlton Heston delivered one of his most profound statements. A man who once marched beside Martin Luther King and stood as a symbol of courage and resilience now reflected on his own mortality. At 77, the actor most famous for playing Moses in the Ten Commandments confessed in his last ever interview, "My life will be over soon." Those words stopped Peter Jennings in his tracks, leaving the anchor speechless. In that moment, with his wife of 60 years by his side, Heston, Hollywood's toughest hero, revealed something few could have imagined. His mind was slipping away. The crew was so stunned that filming ground to a halt. What do you say to a man who, for so long, was the loudest and most powerful voice in America? Born John Charles Carter on October 4, 1923, in Cook County, Illinois, Charlton Heston's life started with confusion. His birth certificate was filed 11 days later, listing him as Charlton Carter. While Heston claimed he was born in Wilmot, most records point to Evanston. This early mix-up would set the stage for a life filled with twists, but also moments of clarity, like his famous roles on Saturday Night Live, Letterman, and The Tonight Show. Heston's early years weren't glamorous. Growing up in the quiet, secluded woods of St. Helens, Michigan, he spent his days hunting and fishing, calling himself a skinny hick from the woods. Little did the boy who wandered the woods know, his destiny would soon take him far from the trees. By 1930, census records listed him as Charlton J. Carter, yet, many believe he later changed his name. At just 10 years old, after his parents' divorce, Charlton's mother remarried Chester Heston, and that's when he adopted the Heston name. Though many thought it came from his mother's maiden name, it actually derived from his grandmother, Marion Charlton. Heston's mother and aunt were adopted to escape an estranged biological father, taking their grandfather's surname as a new beginning. The name Charlton stuck, and even as he rose to fame, those closest to him never strayed from calling him Chuck. At 17, in 1941, he made his film debut in Peer Gynt, a silent film, an odd choice for the era, given that sound films had been the norm for over a decade. Despite its obscurity, Peer Gynt set Heston on a bold path. It was a strange movie, using Norwegian music and staying true to the play's original form. One critic later called its silence haunting, though most dismissed it as a minor role for Heston. But to him, it was the beginning of something far greater. That same year, he enrolled at Northwestern University. In the spring of 1941, he met Lydia Clark in a theater class. Shy, poor, and juggling odd jobs to make ends meet, he was a man of humble beginnings. Yet, Lydia caught his eye, and the connection was instant. They fell deeply in love and married on March 17, 1944, in Greensboro, North Carolina. Their 64-year marriage would stand as one of Hollywood's longest and most enduring. Through the highs and lows of fame, Heston often said he loved Lydia more after 9 years of marriage than on their wedding day. Together, they raised 2 children, Fraser Clark Heston and Holly Heston Rochelle. Despite the challenges of a demanding film career, Heston and Lydia's bond never wavered. Their love story was just as steadfast as the characters Heston portrayed on the big screen. Heston's career didn't stop at film. His television career began in 1949. On March 15, he appeared on Suspense, and just a few months later, on June 15, he debuted on Studio One. These early roles allowed him to showcase his versatility, portraying iconic characters such as Edward Rochester in Jane Eyre, 1949, and Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, 1950. He was just getting started, and the world was about to see the rise of one of cinema's most legendary stars. On October 22, 1951, Charlton Heston took on another iconic role, Macbeth. This was just one of many performances that helped him grow into the powerhouse actor we remember today. Behind the scenes, the CBS team invested more money into Studio One, ensuring the sets and production quality were far superior to other shows of its time. Some critics initially thought Heston's acting style seemed stiff, but his commanding presence and deep voice quickly stood out. By 1955, Studio One was receiving over 500 scripts each week, a clear sign that Heston was becoming a force to be reckoned with in Hollywood. And when Betty Davis says you're talented, you listen. She once remarked, "I think I won this award for doing the kind of chores a whole lot of other people do too. But because I'm an actor, when I do them, they take my picture." It was a humble reminder of the way actors' lives were often scrutinized, but for Heston, it was clear. He was carving his own path. In 1950, he tackled 2 major projects. First was a low-budget Julius Caesar, where Heston took on the role of Mark Antony, a performance that would solidify his growing reputation. Heston was the only paid actor in that Chicago production, but it was his next big break that changed everything. His Hollywood debut came with Dark City, where he portrayed Danny Haley, a bitter gambler running an illegal bookie joint. At just 25, Heston's performance wasn't the movie's biggest draw, but it caught the attention of one very important person, director Cecil B. DeMille. In 1952, DeMille cast Heston in The Greatest Show on Earth, where he played Brad Braden, a circus manager with a tough exterior but a soft heart. Critics praised Heston's Bogart-style toughness, and the film went on to win Best Picture at the Oscars. This role marked Heston's official arrival as a leading man in Hollywood. By 1954, Heston was becoming synonymous with adventure films. He starred in 2 key movies that year. The first, The Naked Jungle, saw him as Christopher Leanigan, a plantation owner battling a devastating army ant plague while navigating a tense marriage. The film pushed boundaries with its bold portrayal of sexual tension between Heston and co-star Eleanor Parker, sparking discussion among critics. Next, Heston flew to Peru for Secret of the Incas, which made history as the first major Hollywood film to shoot at the ancient site of Machu Picchu. Playing Harry Steele, a treasure hunter in search of a lost artifact, Heston's role would later inspire one of the most iconic characters in cinematic history, Indiana Jones. Not only did the film spark a wave of tourism to Peru, but it solidified Heston's place in the adventure genre. Later in 1954, DeMille began casting for The Ten Commandments, but he wasn't immediately sure about Heston. The studio had initially considered other actors, like William Boyd, Jeff Chandler, Dan Daly, and even Rock Hudson. The turning point came when DeMille received a sculpture of Michelangelo's Moses from the Israeli government, and saw how much Heston resembled the statue. Even then, DeMille had doubts. In his diary, he noted Heston's sinister quality and wasn't sure he was attractive enough for the role, but he gave him the part, a decision that would go down in history. In a surprising twist, Heston's son, Fraser, who had just been born, was cast as baby Moses in the iconic basket scene. At just 3 months old, Fraser made his film debut alongside his legendary father. By 1956, Charlton Heston was no longer just a Hollywood actor. He had become a cultural icon, forever tied to the biblical epic genre. As MGM began planning Ben-Hur, the studio was determined to cast the right actor for the lead role. But it was proving to be a messy, long-winded search. Heston wasn't even on the studio's radar at first. Burt Lancaster was offered the role but turned it down, finding the script boring and even offensive toward Christianity. They then turned to Paul Newman, who had recently starred in the biblical flop The Silver Chalice, but Newman was hesitant to take on another biblical role. Marlon Brando also passed on the part. As the search continued, the studio looked at Rock Hudson, but doubts lingered about his ability to take on such a monumental role. At one point, even Leslie Nielsen, then a serious actor, was considered. Desperate, MGM even looked at Italian actors who didn't speak English. But then, director William Wyler turned to Charlton Heston. Having already played Moses in The Ten Commandments, Heston had the voice, the presence, and the gravitas needed to lead Ben-Hur. It was time for the world to see him as the iconic Judah Ben-Hur. And Heston, he looked every bit the part of a man who could command a Roman chariot. The production of Ben-Hur was nothing short of colossal. Just the chariot race alone carried a price tag of $1 million, a staggering sum for its time. It took 5 weeks to film the legendary race, spread across 3 intense months of production. The race itself covered more than 200 miles of actual track. Heston, eager to deliver the most authentic performance possible, began training the moment he set foot in Rome. Every single day, he devoted 3 hours to practicing with the chariot. He had to master the art of steering the horses, handling sharp turns, and enduring the dirt that would constantly fly into his face. To protect his eyes, he wore special contact lenses, a testament to his commitment to realism. But the most unforgettable moment in the race wasn't scripted. It came from a real accident during a stunt. Joe Canut, son of the legendary stunt coordinator Yakima Canut, was thrown high into the air during a jump and slammed hard onto the ground. Despite injuring his chin, Joe survived. Director William Wyler decided to keep the footage, blending it seamlessly with shots of Heston heroically climbing back into the chariot. The result? One of the most iconic and intense moments in cinematic history. The production wasn't just about the race, it was about precision. A total of 78 trained horses, imported from Yugoslavia and Sicily, were used. Heston's chariot team was paired with Andalusians, while the opposition teams rode Lipizzanes, both magnificent breeds that added to the film's grandeur. When Ben-Hur hit theaters in 1959, it was nothing short of a cultural phenomenon. At the 32nd Academy Awards, it took home an astonishing 11 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Heston. This record stood for nearly 40 years until Titanic tied it in 1997. For Heston, this was his first and only competitive Oscar win, but it was the one that sealed his place in cinematic history. From that moment on, he became the go-to actor for historical epics. Critics began to see him as the embodiment of the Hollywood hero, the symbol of an era when movies were filled with serious films and serious heroes. After Ben-Hur, Heston's career reached new heights. He had the power to choose his projects. In 1961, he took on the legendary role of El Cid. By 1965, he portrayed Michelangelo in The Agony and the Ecstasy and John the Baptist in The Greatest Story Ever Told, films that solidified his status as a Hollywood icon. Roger Ebert once said that Heston made at least 3 films everyone sees at some point in their lives: Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, and Planet of the Apes. But even with such a powerful filmography, Heston made some surprising career choices that defied expectations. In 1960, he turned down a major studio film starring Marilyn Monroe, Let's Make Love. Instead, he chose to head to Broadway, where he worked with the legendary Laurence Olivier, who was directing The Tumbler, a play by Ben W. Levy. The play's journey was rocky. It debuted in Boston and struggled before making its way to New York, where it closed after just 5 performances. Despite the critical failure, Time magazine called it harrowingly pretentious, and many saw it as a major flop. Heston didn't regret it. He later told columnist Joe Hyams that the experience was priceless. He'd learned more in 6 weeks working with Olivier than he could have learned in years on his own. Later that same year, he starred in The Wreck of the Merry Deer, a sea thriller with Gary Cooper, based on a novel by Hammond Innes. The story, which began as a gripping mystery, abruptly shifted into a courtroom drama halfway through, leaving critics divided. One reviewer even called the ending the film's weakest part. Despite the mixed reception, the film was a financial success. MGM Records showed it earned $1.165 million in the US and Canada, and $1.65 million overseas. While it cost $2.6 million to produce, it turned a modest profit of $200,000, a small win in a career filled with triumphs. But The Wreck of the Merry Deer didn't live up to the studio's lofty expectations. Heston himself later admitted that the screenplay failed to capture the depth and power of the novel. He also blamed director Michael Anderson for not getting the courtroom scenes right, which he felt detracted from the film's potential. In 1961, Heston found himself back in the realm of epic historical films with El Cid. Shot over 9 months in Spain, El Cid became just as famous for the drama that unfolded behind the scenes as it did for its on-screen spectacle. The tension between Heston and co-star Sophia Loren was palpable, with the two actors openly despising each other. Their off-screen animosity became the talk of the industry. Despite their strong on-screen chemistry, Heston refused to work with Loren again when producer Samuel Bronstein tried to cast him together in The Fall of the Roman Empire. That decision caused major headaches for Bronstein and is believed by some to have contributed to the studio's financial downfall. But El Cid was a massive box office success. The costumes were authentic. The weapons were real. Even the Spanish army participated as extras. Bronstein made a fortune, using the film's success to fund more epics. But Heston, caught in a pattern of playing legendary historical figures, began to feel boxed in. He had already embodied Moses, Ben-Hur, and now El Cid. He feared being typecast in these heroic roles forever. In 1968, Charlton Heston took a bold step in a new direction with Planet of the Apes, a film that would forever change the landscape of science fiction. The production came with its own set of challenges, including the grueling process of applying the ape makeup, which took up to 7 hours to complete and 3 hours to remove. The actors had to start work at 2 a.m. and film until 10 p.m. Makeup artist John Chambers came up with a groundbreaking solution, using foam rubber that allowed skin to breathe and special paint that didn't block pores, revolutionizing the process. The studio spent $345,000 on makeup, but they claimed it cost $1 million to the press. Filming was tough, with actors wearing full prosthetics in desert heat. To avoid ruining their makeup, they drank liquid meals through straws and formed their own groups by ape species off-camera, gorillas with gorillas, orangutans with orangutans. At the same time, a satirical article circulated, making outrageous and completely false claims about Heston. It humorously fabricated a story where he supposedly invited a stagehand for drinks, mocking cancel culture by mimicking the style of real news. In 1971, Heston starred in The Omega Man, a film based on Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. In it, Heston played a man left alone in a post-apocalyptic world ravaged by a pandemic. The movie earned $4 million in the US and Canada and has since developed a cult following. Tim Burton called it his Desert Island film, crediting it with delivering iconic action lines and humor. Then came Soylent Green in 1973, a dark dystopian film set in 2022, depicting a New York City struggling with overpopulation and environmental collapse. The movie explored climate change in a way few films dared to at the time. Based on the 1966 novel Make Room by Harry Harrison, It introduced the shocking twist that Soylent Green, the titular food product, was made from people, a plot element not in the original book. Harrison himself was opposed to the change, and the film's director Stanley Greenberg admitted that the twist angered the author. Cinematographer Richard Klein used green filters to give the film a sick, toxic look, intensifying its bleak atmosphere. In 1974, Heston also starred in Earthquake, which featured 141 stunt performers, a record for the time. At 50, Heston was still doing many of his own stunts, even as the production team used cameras that made the entire frame shake to simulate the real tremors of an earthquake. The stunts were risky, with one of the concrete blocks used in a flood scene being knocked out of place, and another stuntman injured during an elevator crash. In 1972, Heston took a step behind the camera to direct Antony and Cleopatra, a passion project he had dreamed of bringing to life. He had originally hoped that Orson Welles would direct, but when Welles declined, Heston took over the reins himself. Unfortunately, critics didn't share his enthusiasm. The naval battle scenes were cheaply made, reusing footage from Ben-Hur, and the pacing was all over the place. The film never recovered, marking a rare misstep in Heston's career. Interestingly, Charlton Heston didn't always align with the conservative image that many later associated with him. In the 1950s, he was a committed Democrat. His first political involvement came in 1956 when he supported Adlai Stevenson in his bid against Dwight Eisenhower. Although Stevenson lost, Heston remained politically active, supporting John F. Kennedy in 1960 and celebrating his victory. By the early 1960s, Heston's political involvement deepened. He wasn't just a supporter, he became an active participant, stepping into the civil rights movement at a time when most actors remained silent on political issues. On August 28, 1963, Charlton Heston marched in Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He wasn't just part of the crowd, he led it. Around 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial that day. In his later reflections, Heston said it was one of the most important moments of his life and the civil rights movement. He believed the march helped push the Civil Rights Act through Congress the following year. Heston, who had played Moses in the Ten Commandments just 7 years earlier, described Dr. King as a 20th century Moses. The comparison was deeply personal. Though Heston knew his involvement might hurt his career, he never backed down. He famously said, "I marched for civil rights with Dr. King in 1963, and long before Hollywood found it acceptable, I may say." For him, standing up for democracy was a responsibility, one that required action. As he put it, if you believe in democracy, you have to believe in how it works. But Heston's political journey didn't remain static. In 1968, following the tragic assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Dr. King, Heston called for stricter gun laws, even pushing for stronger limits on handguns, shotguns, and rifles. Over time, however, his views shifted. In 1972, while filming The Omega Man, Heston's stance began to change. By the late 1990s, he had joined the National Rifle Association, NRA. In 1997, he became a member of its board, and the following year, he was named president. Under his leadership, NRA membership surged past 4 million. One of the defining moments of his NRA tenure came in 2000, when Heston stood on stage at the NRA convention in Charlotte. He raised a rifle above his head and made the now iconic statement, "From my cold, dead hands." It was a bold declaration of his commitment to the Second Amendment, a cause he saw as a personal freedom to protect. Heston's influence reached far beyond Hollywood. In 1999, he gave a stirring speech at Harvard Law School, addressing the students in a room full of silence and fear. He criticized the political correctness of the time, recalling how in the 1960s, terms like Negro and Black were used freely during marches, but now, those words were banned from conversation. He believed that when people are told what to say, it becomes easier to tell them what to do. He urged the students to stand firm, just as Dr. King had done. He spoke of the power of peaceful protest, a message he continued to preach as the years went on. Then, in August 2000, came a shocking revelation. Heston had entered rehab earlier that year. At 76, he confessed to struggling with alcohol, particularly white wine, a habit he had developed over the years. Though he wasn't slurring or stumbling, he recognized that his drinking had become problematic. His wife Lydia and their son convinced him to get help, marking a moment of vulnerability for the man who had long been a symbol of strength. Charlton Heston and Lydia were married for over 60 years, tying the knot on March 17, 1944, just before he left for military service. Despite their differences, his punctuality versus her tendency to be late, his disorganization against her neatness, their bond only grew stronger. In 1998, at 73, Heston was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Though the diagnosis was not life-threatening, he delayed treatment to finish filming Town and Country and campaign for Republican candidates. By 2001, he was cancer-free. The most challenging moment came in 2002 when, at 77, Heston revealed he had Alzheimer's disease in a private video message. With clarity, he said, "For an actor, there's no greater loss than the loss of his audience. I can part the Red Sea, but I can't part with you." He continued his work, serving as NRA president and speaking at events as long as he could. In December 2002, during his final televised interview, Heston spoke slowly, but still with awareness, saying Alzheimer's was a problem for all those around you. Following his diagnosis, support flooded in, including from Nancy Reagan, who reached out to Lydia. Heston lived with Alzheimer's for over 5 years before passing away on April 5, 2008. At 84, due to complications from the disease. Tributes poured in from all over. President George W. Bush praised his character and legacy in civil rights, the Screen Actors Guild, and his defense of the Second Amendment. Nancy Reagan called him a hero. Heston's funeral on April 12, 2008, in Pacific Palisades was attended by Hollywood and political figures. His ashes were later returned to his family, a final tribute to a man who had dedicated his life to both his craft and his convictions.